Okay, welcome everybody. Today we're going to have a conversation about Future Cities Canada research on place-based hubs and why they play such an important role in our civic commons. Our guest speakers will share insights from the research they've done within the Civic Commons Catalyst and highlight some innovative ways that hubs are connecting, supporting, and empowering their local communities. My name's Ayanna Webb. I'm a program manager at Evergreen and standing in for Michelle German today as host and moderator. So welcome. A few reminders before we get started. You can ask questions throughout the entire conversation. You can do that using your chat function. If you have questions on the fly around acronyms or things that you just want clarified, we'll do our best to get to those as they come up. If there are larger questions for our guest speakers, then we will keep them till the end and hopefully be able to get to all of them, but prioritize them on a thematic and first come, first serve basis. So the webinar was booked for 90 minutes, so it might appear as 90 minutes in your calendar. Don't be fooled. We just did that so it doesn't end abruptly on the hour, but the programming is actually scheduled from 12 to 1 p.m. And so it is going to be just a 60-minute webinar. Hopefully not just a 60-minute webinar. And so if you're having any tech problems during this time, please email jlafren@evergreen.ca. That's jlafren@evergreen.ca. She would have sent you an email with the registration link so that you could get here. So you're probably already in contact with her and could just reply to that thread if you needed any support. Okay, so with that, let me just situate you within the Civic Commons Catalyst. So this webinar is part of a webinar series within Civic Commons Catalyst. The Catalyst, the Civic Commons term within Catalyst has sort of loosely been defined as some of the common spaces within our cities that make our cities what they are. So libraries, parks, schools, community hubs, recreation centers, etc. Some of the things that unify them are that they serve residents' needs and offer that public benefit and economic opportunities and create that sense of belonging. If Civic Commons are really set up for success, we find that they can do much more than that. They can really foster engagement, create opportunities to support equity and prosperity in our cities. So with that, the Civic Commons Catalyst is a fairly new initiative of Evergreen, and it's meant to offer an array of programming seeking to support and scale existing civic initiatives, to prototype new participatory models and support resident-led activities. It really breaks down into three components: a supported learning network, of which the webinar is part, but that hopefully at the end of this will be much more robust than that. A lab where we get to test a challenge question and prototype some new ideas to address it with a few community hubs across Canada. And a community studio, which is sort of an incubator on a local level that is more place-based at Evergreen. So if you want to find out more about that, we will give you some next steps at the end of the webinar to find out more, but that is a high-level overview of what Civic Commons Catalyst is. I'd like to take some time to introduce our wonderful speakers who are joining us today. Marina Queirolo manages Evergreen's initiatives related to food policy, public markets, and hubs. She works to change the status quo of city systems, like food and the use of public spaces, to make them more just, equitable, and sustainable. Marina is leading the development of Future Cities Canada's Hub program, which aims to leverage existing civic assets as a place-based approach to accelerating inclusive urban innovation. She's currently connecting our hub, the redeveloped kiln building in Toronto at Evergreen Brickworks, to other such hubs across Canada. Marina is a member of the Toronto Food Policy Council since 2013, is chair of the council's Public Food Market Working Group, part of the Global Placemaking Council, and has almost 15 years of experience working in food systems and city building. Marina has a BA from the University of Buenos Aires and is currently pursuing a Master of Environmental Studies at York University. Welcome, Marina. Our next speaker is James Chan. He works with people, places, and programs in the areas of social innovation, civic participation, and equitable urbanism. He's a member of London Community Foundation's Social Finance Committee, was a co-founder of Ottawa Civic Tech, and served on the board of directors at Code for Canada, Park People, and the Centre for Active Transportation. Welcome, James. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Marina to get us started. Thanks so much for joining.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for that. I want to start by, first of all, acknowledging who's in the room. And we know we have a lot of people that have a lot of knowledge in this space. And both James and I have been working in what we're presenting for the last almost 2 years. And we would love to have a conversation. So I'm going to try to move really fast on my slides so that we have enough time for discussion after. So this journey began in 2016, thanks to some funding from McConnell Foundation. Sorry, which slide are we at now? Perfect, hubs as part of the Civic Commons. So let's move to the next slide, please. So places where we can do together what we cannot do alone. And so, as I was saying before, this journey of understanding the Civic Commons began in 2016, thanks to some funding from McConnell Foundation. We embarked on a research with 10 cities across Canada to really understand the state of our civic commons. And in our journey, we learned that the civic commons in Canada has a lot of potential. However, it also needs some help. Municipalities are struggling to keep up with the infrastructure and programs that helps keep spaces active and relevant to the new generation. Some of the things that we have found, as much as each city presented its own unique challenges, it had some shared problems. And these will resonate to many of the people that are in the call today. Increased real estate prices, privatization of assets, recession leading after the post-oil crisis, aging infrastructure, and limited budget for programming. On the other hand, we also found some exciting news that a lot of the NGOs and a lot of social innovators are really advancing new ideas and innovating to create programs that address some of the gaps that municipal staff are not able to deliver due to their constraints. So they're advancing issues such as reconciliation, accessibility and inclusion, social isolation, access to nature, and spaces for citizens to be active, social, and physically. However, in many cases, some of the things that we also learned is that these innovations are not connected to municipalities. And so they're acting independently. And so that's one of the biggest gaps that we've identified, the fact that these amazing initiatives advanced by non-for-profits are currently disconnected from the system and are working independently, and both locally and nationally. And so what does all this mean? And so what turns a space into a place and into a space and into a hub? So we know, based on our experience, that great places make great cities. We also know that a place-based approach can integrate social, economic, and environmental issues and make them more manageable and anchored in our current context. We know that we need to create places that have natural ecosystems connected in them. We know that we need to drive inclusive local economic development. We know that we need to create spaces where people can meet and build relationships and build social cohesion and inclusive neighborhoods. We also need to empower residents a lot more in the decision-making process. And last but not least, we know that we have lots of community champions working on the ground that need more support so that we can build those resilient social infrastructure that we're all asking for. And so from that perspective, that is what a hub is. A hub is a place where all these things are happening already. And so part of this Civic Commons Catalyst is anchored in this idea of how do we create and leverage all these places. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna start by sharing a little bit of our experience in our own hub and in the work that Evergreen has been leading for the last 30 years in parks and schools. So, next slide, please. which one are we? Sorry, we're having some challenges. So scaling, okay, sorry. Back again to the slide. So as I said before, what I'm sharing today, a lot of it is based on our experience on site and our experience on a national level. And so I discovered this slide that I'm sharing with you guys a few years ago. It's Frank Giel's Sustainability Transition Framework. And for me, it helped me ground the work that we were doing and allowed to think of how innovations can be scaled and how can they enable that connection of transitioning from prototyping all the way to system change. And so this slide is here to help us think within our programs when we are prototyping, how we allow them to, at the same time, connect them to system change. Next slide. So I'm going to show 3 examples that we did at Evergreen Brickworks that help us sort of inform this practice. First of all, it's our public markets and food program. So for the last, and this is my passion, no? Regional food systems is the area where I have learned most of the work that we've been doing in all other aspects of our programs. We have been operating our public market program since 2008 at Evergreen Brickworks. And it's a perfect example how you move from a prototyping stage and innovation that happens on the ground in community hubs, anchored in this case in food and urban agriculture, with huge impact connecting growers and eaters around a really important issue around food and city building, all the way to then being part of conversations that advance city building by being part of this approach where you bring prototyping that happens in hubs and in places to connect to system change. And so at Evergreen, specifically on our public market program, once we've got to our prototyping stage in a good place, we started conversations with the Toronto Food Policy Council and being part of that movement of collecting evidence that then is shared into policy change. The second activity that I want to talk about is the Children and Nature program. And so similarly, Evergreen worked both at the hub level, but also at school grounds across Canada, advancing our outdoor play and learning to actively engage Canadians in creating healthy, sustainable environments in schools and public spaces. And so in this program specifically, we worked with children and teachers and the school boards to design playgrounds across Canada. And all those prototype and innovations that really started to rethink our playgrounds ended up informing professional development tools, and it ended up informing and building stronger partners with school boards across Canada to really start rethinking how and nudge our landscape on what school grounds should look like for us to really be advancing great playgrounds for where kids can thrive in their early stages. The third program that I want to highlight, and again, all this is just to show that what we're trying to do with the Civic Commons Catalyst is anchored in our experience. And it's anchored on what many of you have been going through, which is learning by doing. And so lastly, when we moved into the Valley with Evergreen Brickworks and we started the hub, we had this question: what is the role of this hub in bringing people into the Valley? And how can this really affect and impact the change on how we see nature and the ravine systems incorporated in the city of Toronto, moving away from the traditional approach of our ravines as a transportation corridor and that divide our neighborhoods and our city into a really great places where people come together. And so again, this journey began, as many times, with innovations happening on the ground. Consultation, community engagement, really trying to understand who's using the ravines, why are they not being used, and try to address the gap between them. And so then it followed by a lot of prototyping, many of those cases using art-based programs that really changed, brought together ecology and art. And what's going on now? Actively involved in changing that idea of what ravines are for us, and advocating for an increased awareness of the role of ravines in the city, and leading all the way to really stronger partnerships with the managers of the space and the City of Toronto, and working together to advance this idea of what could a ravine strategy look for the city, what could this new part for all of us look like. And again, this emerged from prototyping, advancing to changing in regimes, and hopefully getting to a place where the city and the region understand the roles of nature in the city, and that will lead to actually advancing system change. And so based on these three experiences that we've learned from over our last few years, next slide please, we've developed a hypothesis. And this is the hypothesis that then we want to sort of continue to explore with all of you guys through our programs. And so next slide. Hubs can play a big role in scaling up place-based solutions. And one of the reasons and one of the areas that we feel are really important for hubs to own, and the space where they can affect change more substantially, is by creating ways to increase resident participation in the city building process. As they are anchored in communities, they are anchored in place, they are connected to what's happening in the neighborhoods, they have the potential of not only increasing resident participation within their own hubs, and that's what this drawing illustrates, but also they have the potential to become an observatory and a place that are looking for all these small innovations happening in neighborhoods that are creating solutions to current days and everyday problems. And again, bringing them back into the hub and acting as a really great conduit to strengthen their relationship with municipalities, and really become a partner for municipalities to not only advance their city priorities, but also at the same time connect with new kinds of emerging ideas coming from the residents that usually are linked to the problems that they want to be working on collectively. And then this process of connecting these three elements, the hub, the people, the neighborhood, and the city, we're actually creating communities of trust within that neighborhood that will benefit the city as a whole. And so this is part of the hypothesis that we want to explore at the Civic Commons Catalyst, and this is based on our experience in the hub. So thanks, and next slide.
Okay, thank you so much, Marina. I'm just going to interject with a little reminder. If you are planning on asking any questions or if anything was stirred up by Marina's portion of the chat, please do use the group chat function to queue up your questions for us, if even you need something clarified. Thank you, Marina. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to James.
Thank you, Marina and Ayana. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. First of all, thanks for joining us, and thanks for spending your lunch hour with us. Obviously thrilled to see the interest in place-based hubs and the Civic Commons. I was especially thrilled to work with Marina and Evergreen and Future Cities on this, given my work in three kind of examples of these hubs in three cities. I was formerly the manager of partnerships and community engagement at Mars Discovery District in Toronto. And then I went on to lead programming at Impact Hub Ottawa, and now work in managing a social finance fund at Innovation Works in London. So I obviously have some vested interest in this topic, but recognize that the hubs that I've had experience with are very different than the hubs that Marina described. And so partnering with Marina and Evergreen's experience their experience running Evergreen Brickworks for over a decade, and recognizing that even though those are two different kind of worlds, those are still just two examples amongst many different types of hubs out there. So really this work that we did was to really be aligned with what Future Cities Canada was trying to do, in that, you know, it's a key function of learning and knowledge sharing, and acknowledging the good work that's already out there. So why I was excited was, and some of you might share this opinion, having been in this space for a while, is that what we often don't need is more ideas. What we need is to understand the good ideas that are working, what makes them work, and how we can scale and spread those good ideas to other places. And so that was kind of the focus for this research. And a note about that just off the bat, this is not, I'm not an academic. This was not meant to be academic research. They're not meant to be exhaustive. So what we decided to kind of focus on was what would be useful and usable to practitioners, to people who work in hubs, who are thinking about hubs, who are in the space, and what would actually be helpful to them in their work. So what the format kind of that ended up happening was, you know, really kind of quick, digestible 1-2 page case studies that really just show, you know, a quick insight and window into these hubs and their work, and really pull out what's the interesting thing that we can learn from, and how could we potentially spread that interesting thing to more places. Next slide, please, Jasmine. And so the case studies were really just trying to, you know, answer 3 basic questions: the who, what, and the how. And the thing we really tried to do was not only point out what the interesting thing was, but the potential, like I mentioned, for scaling. In this context, I know scaling is another kind of jargony buzzword and means different things to different people. In this case, we wanted to look at scaling not just in terms of replicating ideas, but with each iteration kind of improving upon them to fit the unique context of each community. We're talking about place-based hubs, meaning you know, each place has its own unique local context that needs to be considered. So in any case, when we talk about scaling here, we leaned on the work that McConnell and Tamarack has done, and their definitions of scaling, which has kind of 3 angles, if you're familiar with this. There is scaling out, in terms of impacting just more people, right? So if you've got a hub, if you've got a program that are able to reach X, you're trying to increase that number. Scaling up could mean actually going into influencing and affecting laws, regulations, policy level, really kind of systems change stuff. And then there's a scaling deep, which is really kind of impacting people at a more personal, you know, cultural, behavioral level. So we looked at kind of the potential for all 3 of those avenues. Next slide, please. So let's just get the definition out of the way. Of course, there's many different kinds of hubs, like I said. A lot of things that we looked at don't even call themselves hubs. So we struggled a bit in the beginning just to kind of come to a common consensus and understanding of what we mean by hubs. And so, you know, there's everything from the co-working, co-location kind of examples, like the places I've worked, to community centers, to the schools and parks that Evergreen's worked with, libraries and other civic assets. So I think we can all agree that there's just a wide variety. And so we didn't try to place too fine of a definition on what we considered a hub, but we did need to have some kind of parameters for just to understand what we're looking at. And so what we kind of, the loose definition we came up with was this understanding that a place-based hub doesn't necessarily have to be its own place. I think we often kind of jump to the conclusion that these are organizations that, you know, have their own building, have a physical real estate, you know, have that kind of permanent presence. And of course that's helpful, and a lot of hubs would fall into that category. But we also wanted to look at places or hubs that acted like a hub without, you know, having that requirement of you know, owning or having their own permanent space. So this is kind of our rough, you know, framework. And what we considered hubs in this context would be something that brings people together in real life. And that was the kind of the key word. Lots of virtual communities, lots of online platforms that obviously do a lot of the same things. But in this case, because we're talking about place-based, we thought it was important that these hubs do have some element of activity in bringing people together in person. And that also kind of excludes places that are very kind of almost exclusively transactional or service delivery kind of centers, if you will. So an extreme example might be a Service Ontario, definitely bring together people of all walks of life. I don't think anybody would consider that a hub where they build community. The second kind of level would be something that involves ongoing programming. That has consistency, that has kind of some sort of duration and longevity. So this is really to differentiate from, let's say, one-off events. Let's say a hackathon over a weekend where you are bringing people together in real life, but the model is not set up for a sustained engagement. There's no way to sustain that community. So that's kind of another point of differentiation. And the third is, place-based. Again, it has to have some local connection. So again, the point of differentiation here would be, let's say, national organizations with national mandates may have local chapters, but not a ton of actual local activities for us to kind of say, yep, that's a place-based hub where they bring people together to co-create and to collaborate. So again, not to say this is the one answer, the correct answer, but just the framing that we use. Next slide, please. And so Marina touched on this a little bit in her last slide in that framework. But what we wanted to do was to categorize them in kind of three really broad categories, and these are not mutually exclusive, and it may not even be true in all cases, but you can kind of think of these three categories as different levels of depth of engagement. And when you look at different hubs and their mission, their mandate, their scope of work, and the scope could include both, what they do, the activities, as well as their geographic kind of mandate. But you can kind of scope out this framework around, there's the core of what all hubs kind of do, which is really to connect and bring people together. So really cultivating not just an environment, but a culture of collaboration, bringing like-minded, like-hearted people and organizations together. You will recognize some of these hubs that will offer programming, events, really focusing on building that sense of community and making connections. And some of them will go one step further to actually offer structured programming with, very defined pathways, how you access resources or mentorship, other kind of tangible support. So that's kind of the first category. And there's, again, examples of this type of hub for a long time before all this language about hubs came into, even think your very traditional organizations like a Rotary Club or Kiwanis or something like that, I would say, or places of worship and faith communities have been doing this work forever. The second one is our hubs that do something to strengthen connection and relationships, understanding, and really build that relationship between residents and their local government. And really, so what we're talking about here is civic participation, participating in the democratic process. And lots of hubs do this through building knowledge, capacity, and some hubs you'll recognize, are really focused on the process of how you bring people together in this way and how you encourage and empower people to participate, as opposed to focus on the issue. So these are not issue-based organizations, but really process-heavy, process-focused ones. And again, some of the traditional organizations you might recognize would be anything kind of in the realm of leadership development, political engagement, that kind of thing. And then the third category would be ones that really bring not just the change makers, the community and residents together, not just policymakers, but kind of the surrounding adjacent folks like researchers, practitioners, people who are trying to make decisions and policy for a very large collective, and hubs that are able to bring those folks together with the people that they are directly affecting. And so what they're really aiming at here is better decision-making, better collective problem solving that is resident informed, that is evidence-based. And so we looked at some hubs from that kind of category as well. So essentially these were the three broad categories, and we decided to focus on three each for a total of 9. Next slide, please. And so we obviously tried, amongst that kind of wide spectrum of hubs, we also tried to showcase hubs from all across Canada, given that this is for Future Cities Canada. We tried for geographic diversity. Of course, it's very tough in a country as large as Canada. We interviewed a whole bunch of organizations, almost 10. We did a lot of research and talked to people, and ultimately included 9 in the case studies. Like I mentioned, 3 for each of those categories. So you'll see here where they're located across Canada. And as somebody who used to live in Toronto and no longer lives there, I was kind of particularly proud that we managed to feature 9, and none of them are from Toronto. So that was, I think, an important thing that doesn't happen all too often. Next, please. And so here are the 9. I'll run through them really quickly. Of course, it's impossible on this call to kind of dive deep into all of them. The point of these case studies are that they obviously will be published and shared and circulated by Future Cities, and that's happening soon. But what we wanted to kind of on this webinar was to give everybody a little kind of understanding of the process behind it, what our thinking was, and just talk a little bit and hopefully have a conversation about some of the early things that we took away. For the first category about connecting and supporting community, we looked at BC Artscape's Sunwa Arts and Culture Hub. For those of you who are from Toronto, you'll recognize Artscape, obviously. This is their BC kind of division that do very similar things. We looked at Entremise, who is working very closely with one of the founding collaborators of Future Cities. So they were already kind of in that orbit of partners in Montreal. And then we looked at New Dawn Enterprises, who really are based in Sydney, but are there and serve the entire island of Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. Next, please. For the hubs that strengthen and really connect residents around civic participation, we looked at Synapcity in Ottawa, Beta City in Edmonton, and the London Youth Advisory Council from London, Ontario, where I live. And I think actually Melissa, who's the executive director of the LYAC, is on the call. So I'm really happy to have her hopefully be able to share her insights and expertise on that. Next, please. And then lastly, for enabling better decision making, we looked at 3 really interesting organizations. Again, these are probably the ones I would say look and feel the least like a hub in our traditional sense of the word. When we think of a hub, we think of, again, a place that does certain things. And these ones were really kind of on the edges a little bit, but I think have the most interesting things to share. So Montreal's essentially a public consultation office, which is kind of a legislative third arm's length government agency in a way. Vivo in Calgary, formerly called Cardell Place, and Winnipeg Boldness Project, obviously from Winnipeg. And I should mention both Vivo and the Boldness Project are actually being featured in the next webinar, so that would be a great opportunity to dive a little deeper into what and how they do their work. Next, please. So for the remainder of this call, what I want to do is just surface some, I said initial takeaways. They're not really takeaways. I frame them as questions because as we went through the different hubs and the interesting, innovative, creative things that they do, or it might be a how they're doing it, it's not to say, oh, this is the answer and this is what we can apply immediately. Of course, a lot of it, just is kind of provocations and questions for us to think about. So I'll run through, really quickly, kind of just a little bit of what they do and the questions that they raise for us at least, and hopefully for everybody who's able to read the case studies and take away some insights and lessons for your own work. In the case of Sunwa in BC, in Vancouver, what I liked about them was they had a similar kind of arts and cultural hub. Again, if you're familiar with Artscape's work in Toronto or 401 Richmond, something very similar, bringing together different arts and cultural organizations under one roof and building community around that. But what they did was a very intentional way of looking at inclusion. In their case, they are located in the heart of Chinatown in Vancouver. And really decided to have a very intentional way of respecting their surrounding community, understanding that by their very presence and coming into that community, they are bringing about change. And some change is good, some change is less positive, and especially sometimes this change affects the residents in that neighborhood in a way that they don't really have any agency or say over. And so the case study kind of looks into how. This is a lesson about how they did things, not what, of engaging their local community and really bringing them into everything from governance to staffing to decision making, and really sharing some of that control and decision making power with their surrounding community. So really brought kind of a different lens to when we say a place-based hub. Entremise is interesting. They operate, or they're opening, kind of temporary transitional spaces for change makers and collaborators. So very similar to, Innovation Works here or Impact Hub, but they're doing it in partnership with the city and using either vacant or underutilized spaces. So what I liked about that was, in some cases, and especially those of you who have worked with municipal government, it might have been actually easier for them to go find their own space and do what all these other hubs have done across the country. But they went down a specific path because that option would kind of bring about different types of benefits, and again, in a very place-based kind of context. So, being very intentional about what neighborhoods that they are going into, and what outcomes they're able to bring about, even in a very transitory, temporary kind of framing. And then the last one in New Dawn and in Cape Breton, what I found interesting was that they are actually the oldest Community Economic Development Corporation in Canada, CED, if you're familiar with that term, and essentially been doing social enterprise for over 30 years, well before that term has entered the lexicon. So there's some lesson there, I think, that we wanted to draw out around, looking at does jargon and language, because there's all this, jargon around social enterprise, social innovation, that kind of overlap with the world of community economic development, which has been around for a very long time. It's a term that is still very kind of vague and not really well understood. So just, a lot of questions there around how sometimes we build up a whole set of language in an attempt to build an ecosystem, and sometimes that helps and sometimes that hinders. Next slide, please. For the next three, a lot of this is around civic engagement, participation. So some of the interesting kind of provocations there are around how we look at barriers to engagement and participation. So a lot of folks do amazing work in just trying to reach people and addressing some kind of knowledge gap, right? And delivering training or some kind of experience that helps people gain knowledge. But I think what's interesting about Synapsity's work is that they are also understanding the human side, the people side of things, and recognizing that there are sometimes hidden barriers to participation that the municipality or other traditional agencies have not been able to crack. Everything from feeling confident to speaking up in a large room, to anxieties about going into a new place, a new process, and people that you don't know. And so a lot of these barriers they have kind of embedded into their work around civic participation. I'll jump down to the bottom one to the London Youth Advisory Council, and of course Melissa can speak much more to what they do, but what I thought was interesting was very similar in terms of the learning by doing, right? So their specialties is engaging youth, and again, the way that they are able to engage and get youth involved in the democratic process, which of course is a challenge all across Canada. Lots of people are trying to figure that out, but they focus on a model that is really on the learning by doing. And so not just sitting and learning about how the system works and who to contact and all that kind of stuff, but actually going through the process, running as a youth counselor, being elected, and essentially, going through that process and working with stakeholders to come up with creative solutions, addressing problems and issues that they care about. And so that value of not just the learning by doing, but doing it with other people. And the value of a kind of an in-person peer group is really important. And then in the middle point about what's possible when residents collaborate. This is an example of a civic tech group. So this would be kind of equivalent to the one I helped co-found in Ottawa, where you have residents who come together with city staff, but in a totally different way than what people are used to. Usually people show up to consultation. It's a very kind of, us versus them dynamic. Somebody's always on the defensive, somebody's always angry, and it just doesn't lead to a good outcome. And so civic tech groups and the model that they've been pioneering across the country is really this kind of non-confrontational, non-hierarchical, very low barrier environment for people to come and actually build things together. And first it started as residents working with each other, but as trust grows, as relationships grow, you see examples just like this one in Edmonton, where the city recognized this is a really valuable resource to tap into and worked with residents in a way that I think very few of us would kind of recognize in our own cities. And they saw a common challenge that had a bit of a technology angle. You have residents who are tech savvy and are able to contribute their time and their talents in a unique way, and actually, co-created a solution that had real benefits to the residents of Edmonton. Next slide, please. And then the last three, around the better decision making, like I said, really interesting insights here. The Montreal's example, which is kind of essentially creating a arm's length, kind of third party, neutral, independent, protected by legislation, and this entity is charged with civic engagement for matters that are referred to them by their council. And so that's a really unique setup I have not seen anywhere else in other Canadian municipalities. But there's really interesting lessons there, given their long history. They've been doing this for over 15 years now, of not just doing better engagement and better processes, but really building that kind of relationship with residents so that, as we all know, there's often a level of cynicism and pessimism when residents, even the ones that do participate, that do engage, often do it with, they're kind of resigned to this, inevitability that, who's really listening to what I'm saying? And so really just goes to show the importance of building that process and the long time it takes to build that credibility and trust in that process, so that the outcomes, even if it's not something you agree with, even if it's not what you want, how you want it to play out, you still trusted the process enough to know that it ended up in a good place. The second one is around upstream interventions is really interesting. So Vivo actually is a rec center. It's a community center, athletic center, whatever you want to call it, fitness. We all have one of these or many of these in our cities, but they've gone one step further to say, well, we're not here to just sell gym memberships and help people get healthy that way. Of course, we have kids signing up for soccer, we have people coming in to swim and all that kind of stuff. But they actually have a separate kind of R&D and innovation team to really put in place these upstream interventions. Say, well, if we really are here to, as their name implies, raise healthier generations, we got to do more. We have to kind of engage people before they even come and decide to get a gym membership. And so they've really done a lot of work in engaging and leveraging that level of, again, the relationships that they've built with people. A rec center is a very friendly place. It doesn't really scream, bureaucratic process or anything like that. So they've been able to leverage that relationship that they have with their clients and their customers and engage them in a way that are able to inform policy. And so they're working with everybody from Calgary's Parks Department to the library system to private developers who are building new neighborhoods, all in a way, and to help residents actually inform how these places, these buildings, this infrastructure is designed and built, and it's all through the lens of the social determinants of health. And really, that's the upstream part is improving public health outcomes well before people even come for a workout. And the last example, Winnipeg Boldness Project, this is really kind of around the idea of taking control of a community's narrative. So they work in a particular neighborhood in Winnipeg, the North End, which is, disadvantaged historically. A lot of, in Toronto, we would know them as maybe they used to be called priority neighborhoods or neighborhood improvement areas. And so there's kind of lessons there around whose story are we telling? And often we have a lot of well-meaning nonprofits, charities, social service agencies who are trying to do their best. And through their work, whether it's for fundraising, whether it's to get volunteers, tell the story and tell the story of their clients in a way that is really not helpful. And so really this is kind of an example of asset-based community development at work here. And I think I think I saw somebody from Tamarack on the list on the call here who have been doing a lot of work and building out that body of knowledge around asset-based community development and spreading that. And so I've talked for a long time. I'll stop here and top it over to questions, but really just an initial overview of kind of the things that we were thinking about and looking at when it came to these case studies. And hopefully when they are published and shared, you will find that they are relevant and useful to your work, and that there are some, what we're hoping for is for you to kind of see some nugget and it's like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that existed. I had no idea they did this. Or if it's something that you do know exists, but really digging into how do they do that? How do they do a certain thing well in a way that engages people, that connects community, that results in better collective decision making. And so that's our hope for the research we've done. So I'll pass it back over to Ayanna. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James. That was great. And I think one of the pieces that we're doing right now is talking to all of those hubs again around how representative the work that has been done is for the stuff that they're doing. And we're learning through this process that they don't get to hear about other hubs like them. So hopefully there is a lot to take away from the research that has been done, and it's only the beginning of connecting hubs that do a variety of different pieces that are all kind of unique and can learn from one another. So I want to open it up to discussion and questions, noticing that there isn't a whole lot in the group chat around questions. So if you do have any questions, get them in. We have about almost 10 minutes to have a little bit of a discussion. I do have a first question for you folks, and maybe we can start with Marina. I don't think there's a black and white answer to this question, but I think you position hubs a little bit about connecting residents to municipalities and making that, I guess, distance shorter, and creating opportunities for residents to engage in civic participation the way that we hope city building could get done. My question is around the labor. So I think there are different schools of thought around residents should be engaging in city building on an ongoing basis and be very invested in it. And then there's another maybe opposing area around that being a paid area, a place of work, and then where is it appropriate to bring in residents and where is it not? So I think my question is around how much accountability should residents have to shaping the cities that they live in, and how much should that fall on municipalities? What is the sweet spot and the balance? And then how do community hubs maybe fill that, or should they?
Thank you. That is a really great question. And as you pointed out, it's not an easy answer. And I think the most successful examples where residents have been meaningfully participating in city building, both talk about balancing the power. So this is balancing the power of between municipality and residents. But more importantly, they always talk about funneling resources to make this happen. So is that salaries? I don't think so, but definitely I think the key point starts with enabling residents to participate in the things that matter to them, because they're issues that they want to solve. So they're not being consulted on things that the municipality wants to be talking. They're like really creating dialogue in the things that they care about. And secondly, I think eventually you have to find a model where resources are funneled back into the community so that they can do these kinds of prototypings that we're talking about. And it's not up to the residents to be the one putting the labor, the energy, the time more a shared approach. Because also, if not, it's going to become again an exercise of only the ones that are able to have the resources to be part of the conversation. So if you really want to, it touches on the inclusivity part. If you really want to create inclusive places, there has to be some resource that goes back to the community. And so I don't know if James wants to talk a little bit about that, but my line of thought would be true meaningful participation has some resource sharing.
Yeah, I would agree. My mind goes to the example of the civic tech where there's different groups experimenting with different models, like Marina mentioned. A lot of them are volunteer driven and essentially passion projects. But then there is a certain point and a certain opportunity, and we've seen a couple of examples out of Toronto actually, where the city said, "Yep, we want to work with you guys and recognize that this is work, like this is work that needs to be resourced," as Marina said, and have found a really kind of unique, novel ways to essentially allocate or funnel money to these projects. And it's hard because these are new models of participation. This does not follow the usual, nonprofit or charity applies for a grant from the city. You sign a contribution agreement, right? You get money and you report back in 12 months. Like that's, everybody knows how that's done. These new ways are new. And so it's really interesting to see municipalities who are a bit more progressive and finding ways, and sometimes it's bureaucratic loopholes that they've got to get around to supporting residents when appropriate. In some cases that is putting money on the table. Some cases it's offering data and other resources. In some cases it's a commitment to bringing in prototypes in-house to test with the commitment that they would try to adopt it if it works out. So there are lots of different ways to resource this other than just signing a grant agreement.
Yeah, and we talked about this idea of creating spaces for the residents to be part and collaborate, and that how important it is when you want to have more resident participation is to build their capacity. Mm-hmm. And so, and that comes in different ways. So capacity is like building their skills many times, mm-hmm. to feel comfortable to be part of these conversations, but also removing all the barriers. So again, a lot of it is listening, actively listening to what are the barriers for residents to participate. And then we also know that many hubs are already doing this work. And so it's not that it's not like we talked a lot with James that it's not only the job of municipalities to figure this one out. We have a lot of non-for-profits that are doing great work, and that was a little bit about the intention of these case studies, was just to do a starting point and highlight the work that is out there and say, hey guys, we want to work together. Mm-hmm. We want municipalities to come together with non-for-profits doing great work and really build on each other's skills to find ways. So we don't have the right formula. I think this is the beginning of the journey. And we know that there's a lot of people trying to talk about the same thing. Like at Evergreen, we're part of advisory councils. Like we're currently working with the Toronto Environmental Alliance to really, and sort of the Transport TO team to figure out what the role of hubs are. There's the Ontario Hubs Committee. And so there's a lot of people in this landscape trying to do great work. And that's why we wanted to advance the conversation in this webinar.
Thank you both. I think the idea of what is the formula or the new approach to resource sharing for community engagement within hubs for the purpose of civic participation is a really interesting question. So thank you for coming around to that. There are no additional questions on the group chat, and I think if there's anything that's last and burning, we might have a minute for it. So if you want to get that out, you can. I'm going to wait. I've been always told that I should wait 8 seconds after asking if people have questions for them to come to terms with the fact that they don't. And maybe we just do have a lot of lurkers on our webinar today, and that's perfectly fine. So I think that means that there are no more questions. So thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciated having you. As I said, this webinar kind of falls in with a larger series that connects a lot of the Civic Commons work that is happening across Canada. Our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, August 13th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. Recognizing that is 9 a.m. in BC, so apologizing to all of the BC folks who might be joining us today and on an ongoing basis. Our next webinar will focus on evidence in action in the Civic Commons. So join us in a conversation about how the Winnipeg Boldness Project, which was mentioned today, and Vivo for Healthier Generations, also mentioned today, as well as other place-based initiatives have linked action, storytelling, evaluation, and policy development to capture the stories of real people. And how they use that in their day-to-day work. So please join us. Please continue to follow us in our monthly series of sharebacks. Really, the intention is to share back from Civic Commons, daring to do things differently and leading the way in unique participatory initiatives. So upcoming topics include turning spaces into places, which is happening in September, adaptive reuse with integrity, to build community assets, which is happening in October with Entremise in Montreal and UDON Enterprises in Cape Breton, both of which were mentioned today. And moving from consultation to co-creation in November, we're really excited to be able to host you, and we'll continue to put out the series of webinars that are happening. So with that, I really want to thank James and Marina for joining us today. I think you added some really valuable insights to this conversation, and the Hub's research that you've undertaken has really helped to set the tone for how we better position Civic Commons to be as impactful as they could be. And so thank you for joining us. Thank you everybody for joining us. And if you're interested in being showcased or learning about the 3 elements of programming under Civic Commons Catalyst, please do get in touch. You can reply to our follow-up to this webinar that's going to be put out by Jasmine Lefren at jlefren@evergreen.ca, and we'll get in touch to explore your involvement. Thanks again, and let's move on out.